Okay, so we took a look at prime lenses. Great option for a lot of people getting started out in DSLR video. They want zooms. Zooms are very popular because they let you change lenses less often.
Absolutely. I mean, why have 3 or 4 lenses when you can have 1?
Well, there are certain aesthetic benefits.
Of course, but I'm saying
yeah.
I'm saying that for ease of use, sometimes, of course, it's nice to have that zoom lens so you're not swapping out as often.
Well, and this is my favorite zoom lens when I'm on vacation. This is my tourist lens, 28 millimeter to 300 millimeter. Great range of coverage,
Yep.
but very hard to rack focus on because as I zoom in on this lens, the f-stop is going from 3.5 to 5.6. So if I'm zoomed all the way in to 300 millimeters, I might not be able to rack focus because I have too great of a depth of field.
Right, and that sort of variable depth of field that's going on, we talked about in the previously, is that sort of subtle change of attention, if you will, by the viewer, and it's often sort of amplified by a nice soft background blur that you get with a fast lens. And as you pointed out, one of the problems with a variable aperture zoom lens is that that background blur quality can possibly change as you're zooming in and out, making your rack look a little kind of weird.
Yeah, so let's take a look at that here. I've got a constant lens hooked up. This is a 70 to 200 millimeter, 2.8 all the way through.
Yep.
And right now, I'm at f4.5.
Okay.
So notice our subjects there, they're about 1.5 feet apart.
Yep.
At 4.5, I could easily control focus here, right? Like this would be the difference between the person's nose in focus and the back of their head being out of focus.
Sure.
Now, as I'm dealing with this, I know that that subject's in focus. I've placed my target over it and I'm using the autofocus on the camera to check. It racks, locks in. I've nailed it. I could push the magnify button a lot of times and zoom in to really check, and again, you're blowing up the image there a bit, but you can rack that yourself.
Yep.
So it feels pretty good. Now, I've looked at the lens itself here, and I see that that's reading as basically 6 feet.
Okay.
Well, that other thing,
It's maybe about 6.25, 6.5.
that's probably closer to 7. That's probably about a foot distance. Now, I'm just going to pull back out, and so as I'm looking at that there, our second subject is about a foot away. If I look at the lens, I can actually see numbers on it, and so I can go from 6 feet to 7 feet.
And look at that, it's actually in focus.
Now, you may have to practice,
Right.
and that's a very small movement here that's hard to do fluidly. Lay off the caffeine, make sure you get some sleep. It's hard to get that movement fluid,
Right.
but that's really what that's designed for. Now, let's go ahead and change the f-stop on the camera, and we'll see that that distance changes even further.
Okay.
So as I start to modify here, now, sometimes on these cameras, if you're in live view mode, changing the f-stop doesn't actually change the f-stop until you get in and out.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna flip that off for a second,
Yep.
pop out of live view, pop back in.
Right, and then you can have your updated f-stop. Yep.
Yeah, so now we're at 2.8, and you notice that the second monkey is blurrier.
Of course, because you opened up the lens and increased your background blur there. Yep.
Yeah, now it's not uncommon when doing that to have to adjust the ISO because more light was coming into the camera.
Of course.
Now, as I make that change there, again, the f-stop and the ISO may not live update on the camera. So you might have to, again, pop in and out.
And of course, this is just a camera-specific thing. In this particular Nikon we're shooting with, that's the case. Other cameras, it might not be.
So let's just pop out of that, and we'll go back in. It looks good. Now, this is one of the benefits that I like on some of these older style prime lenses. Look at that. I could see the f-stop with a real dial.
Of course. What a novel idea.
A novel idea. But again, it's not great for shooting stills. So I've got that same idea, and I'm just going to look through the viewfinder here, and this makes it a bit easier. And I could use that as I rack. So I'll find the first position. It feels about right. And I'll turn to the second one. I just overshot it. So that's where that whole practicing comes in.
Yep.
All right, that's in focus. Slow turn. And I'm moving between.
There you go. Now, I should point out, though, the nice thing about this, because you're on a fixed aperture lens at 2.8,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if you were to zoom in more or zoom in less, that background quality and that background blur would remain the same, and sort of the repeatability of that rack would also remain the same because it's a fixed aperture lens.
Yeah, as I adjust that, the f-stop did not change. Notice it still reads as 2.8 throughout that.
Yep.
So I pushed in a little further. I'm all the way at 200 millimeters now. And using my eyepiece so I could really see what's happening,
Yep.
I've hit focus for the front and the back.
Yeah. And so, in many ways, Rich, shooting with a fixed aperture zoom lens for purposes of rack focusing is kind of the same thing as shooting with a prime lens, with the added benefit that you have variable amount of reach. Now,
Yeah.
again, when you go with sort of the variable aperture lens, you get the reach, but then you have the additional problem of sort of the background blur quality changing based on the aperture change.
So it's really a matter of personal preference, though, because the cost of that constant aperture lens would have been about the same as the cost of 4 or 5 used prime lenses for the old ones,
Totally.
or even 3 new prime lenses. So there are aesthetic benefits and technical benefits to both. It's really a matter of personal preference. If you're going to be picking up a zoom, though, for shooting video, you're probably going to have to graduate from the really fast autofocus, tourist style mom and pop lenses, and go to a more professional lens, higher quality series that has that constant aperture.
So, Rich, one of the things I just got to point out is that when you were futzing with the focus control there, and you were kind of trying to go between 6 feet and 7 feet and whatever, repeatability of that is challenging. And you did mention it takes a little practice, which I agree with. And coming up in a little bit, we'll talk about using a device called a follow focus to help us with this rack focusing. But there's one little small technique that I want to share. And we've discussed this previously before we started recording today, and that's just using a small little piece of tape in a similar way that you would use markings on, say, a follow focus unit. And that is just to put it right around the focus ring, just like that. And the problem is that these numbers are pretty hard to see on the end of the lens and sort of the distance little window there. So what you can do is find your first focus point, and then on the piece of tape, just kind of make a mark there, because the distance window here has a little mark on itself. So if you can get those 2 marks to kind of line up, you can easily and repeatedly make that focus happen.
Well, and I could cheat too. Like if I want to make this easier to see, I could put my own piece of tape right up there with a line to just give me my own target. And so I've got that. I've zoomed in here. If you take a look at the camera's feed, I've magnified it up, and I've really punched in very large. But I could use that, or even the autofocus on the camera, so it locks in, and I'll say, all right, great. Let's just put a tick mark there, and that lines up.
So, Rich, I think I know where you're going with this. So you got focus, you marked the first point. Now, why don't you move over to the second little monkey guy there on the table? Right there, and you maybe just pan up a little bit with a little D-pad on the back of the camera, and now physically move the focus ring and find that new focus point. There you go. That looks right.
I'll just punch in there to make sure.
Okay.
I was close.
That's perfect. I like that. And now you'll just make another little mark on your piece of tape there. And now, in a much easier way than looking at the actual distance window on the lens itself, you got these nice markings. And guess what? You can simply just take the piece of tape off when you're done with it. No harm, no foul.
So if we're here, and I can now rack between those 2 values and use those marks as a guide, and that's a lot easier because you might be able to just catch that out of the corner of your eye. So that's a good tip. Works really, really well. Now, this is the budget-oriented solution, the tape, the pen, but hey, that's okay. A lot of people doing DSLR filmmaking are on a budget.
Oh, hold on. This technique will apply to exactly what we're going to talk about next, right? It's the non-budget solution of the dedicated follow focus, which its main purpose, besides letting you follow focus, which we've talked about in previous episodes, help you do repeatable rack focusing as well.
So we're going to take a look at that on this Panasonic AF100, which is a type of camera that a lot of folks doing cinema style shooting or graduating from DSLR are using. The follow focus on the side there is going to make it very easy to mark out our different focus positions. And on top of it, instead of having this really tiny little mark that we have to hit, very, very small movement, it's going to basically use a system of gears to step that, so you have a finer range of control and you're not trying to go
Exactly.
So we'll be right back.